The storm was a thing of impossible fury, a maelstrom of wind and lightning that clawed at the peaks of the misty mountains. It was a tempest born of the world's magic, ancient and untamed. But for the being plummeting through its heart, it was merely another variable in a catastrophic equation of failure. Inside the cockpit of the TA Advanced X-1, alarms shrieked a symphony of death. Red lights flashed across the control yoke, reflecting in the polished black helmet of its sole occupant. Darth Vader did not panic. Panic was an indulgence for lesser beings, a flaw in the programming of flesh that he had long since purged. He was a creature of cold logic and calculated rage, and at this moment, logic dictated that his situation was beyond recovery. The jump to hyperspace had been compromised. A desperate maneuver to escape a rebel ambush near the outer rim had intersected with an uncharted gravitic anomaly. The hyperdrive screamed, reality fractured, and the fabric of space-time, which he had always understood as a constant, had torn like cheap cloth. He had been thrown, not across the familiar star lanes of his galaxy, but into something else entirely, something other. The descent was violent. The starfighter, a marvel of imperial engineering, was being ripped apart by atmospheric forces it was never designed to endure. One of its bent-wing solar arrays tore away with a groan of tortured metal, spiraling into the churning clouds below. The viewport, reinforced to withstand micrometeoroids and laser fire, began to crack under the immense pressure, fine crystalline lines spreading like a spider's web. Through the fracturing transparisteel, he saw not the cold vacuum of space or the gaseous expanse of a nebula, but land, a world of staggering primordial grandeur. Jagged mountains, like the teeth of some colossal beast, clawed at a sky bruised purple and black by the storm. Below, vast, dark forests carpeted the valleys, an unbroken sea of green that seemed to stretch to eternity. There were no lights of civilization, no ordered patterns of agriculture, no orbital stations, nothing. It was a world untouched by the industrial hand of any galactic power he knew. He felt it through the Force. This world was teeming with life, but it was a strange, discordant song. The Force was here, undeniably, but it was different. It felt raw, ancient, woven into the very rock and root of the planet. It was less a universal energy field and more a tapestry of localized power, of deep slumbering things in the earth and soaring sharp intelligences in the high airs. There was light and there was shadow, but they felt elemental. Not the disciplined, focused power of the Jedi and the Sith, but something wilder, more chaotic, a song sung in a language he was only just beginning to comprehend. The final impact was inevitable. He sealed his armored suit, the hiss of the respirator a familiar, steady rhythm against the cacophony of the fighter's death throes. He did not brace for the crash. He reached out with the Force, cocooning himself in a protective bubble of telekinetic energy, a shield against the kinetic fury that was about to be unleashed. The TIE Advanced struck the mountainside with the force of a small meteor. Metal screamed as it plowed a deep furrow through rock and ancient ice, shedding pieces of its fuselage like a dying insect losing its shell. The ship cartwheeled, its cockpit section breaking away and tumbling end over end down a steep, snow-covered slope, before finally coming to rest in a crumpled heap against a sheer cliff face. For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the howling of the wind and the distant crack of thunder. The storm seemed to pause, as if holding its breath to witness what would emerge. Then, with a pneumatic hiss, the transparisteel canopy was blasted away from the inside. Twisted metal groaned as it was bent outwards by an unseen power. From the smoking ruin, a figure rose. Tall, clad in armor as black as the void between stars, his form was a stark, geometric intrusion into the wild, organic landscape. A ragged black cape, torn in the crash, billowed in the wind. The only sound he made was the rhythmic, mechanical breathing that was both his life support and his proclamation of existence. Darth Vader stood in the snow of the misty mountains and surveyed his new reality. His ship was destroyed. His connection to the Empire, to his galaxy, was severed. He was alone. He reached out with the Force, a sweeping, galaxy-spanning search for a familiar presence, a flicker of the Imperial network, a whisper of his master's power. Nothing. He was adrift in an unknown sea. The cold was intense, but it did not penetrate his suit. The air was thin, but his respirator compensated. These were trivial matters. The primary concern was survival, followed by assessment, and then domination. It was the only way he knew. He turned his helmeted gaze towards the mountain's dark heart. The storm offered no shelter, only oblivion. The deeps, however, They promised refuge. He felt life down there, deep within the rock, crude, brutish, chaotic life. It was a starting point. He began to walk, his heavy boots crunching in the snow, leaving a trail of black footprints that led away from the ruin of one galaxy and into the heart of another. The familiar snap hiss of his lightsaber igniting cut through the wind's howl, its crimson blade a promise of the order he would bring to this new savage world. The entrance was a jagged wound in the mountainside, a natural fissure widened by crude tools and the passage of countless bodies. The air that exhaled from its depths was foul, thick with the stench of rot, filth, and unwashed flesh. To any ordinary man it would have been a descent into a lightless, suffocating hell. To Darth Vader it was merely a tactical environment. The darkness was an ally, and the stench was irrelevant data. He moved through the upper tunnels with a purpose that bordered on silent teleportation. His suit, designed for the corridors of starships and the sterile environments of Imperial bases, was surprisingly adept in the rough-hewn caves. His sensors, augmented by the Force, painted a three-dimensional map in his mind. He saw the flow of air, the stress points in the rock, and the heat signatures of the creatures that infested this place. They were goblins. He had no name for them, but the Force whispered their nature to him. They were small, hunched creatures with sallow skin and wide, malevolent eyes accustomed to the gloom. They moved in skittering packs, their minds a constant chatter of base desires, hunger, cruelty, fear, and a petty, grasping greed. They were a cancer in the mountain's heart, a microcosm of the chaos he had sworn to eradicate from the galaxy. He observed them for a time, a black statue in the shadows of a forgotten passage. He watched them squabble over scraps of meat, torment captured cave creatures, and cower before larger, more brutish members of their kind. Their social structure was built on fear and violence, simple, predictable. He had dismantled far more complex societies. His first move was not an attack, but an announcement. He strode from the shadows into a larger cavern, a central hub of sorts where dozens of the creatures were gathered around a smoky fire. His lightsaber was deactivated, but his presence alone was enough to silence their guttural chatter. Heads snapped in his direction, their pale eyes widening at the sight of this towering iron giant who breathed with the sound of a death rattle. For a moment they were frozen, a collective instinct of self-preservation warring with their natural aggression. Then, a larger goblin, adorned with a necklace of bones and wielding a crude notched scimitar, let out a screeching war cry. It was a challenge, an assertion of dominance. It was a mistake. Before the creature could take a second step, it was lifted from its feet by an invisible hand. Its throat constricted, its scimitar clattering to the stone floor. Its legs kicked uselessly in the air as it was raised higher and higher, its eyes bulging with terror and confusion. Vader did not move a muscle. He simply closed his fist. A sickening crunch echoed through the cavern as the goblin's neck snapped and its body was tossed aside like a broken doll. The spell of inaction was shattered. The goblins, driven by a mixture of fear and rage, swarmed him. They came from all sides, a tide of rusted blades and jagged spears. The lightsaber ignited with its iconic snap hiss. The crimson blade became a whirlwind of incandescent death. Vader's movements were a masterclass in lightsaber combat, a blend of Form 5's overwhelming offense and Form 3's perfect defense. He was a singularity of destruction in their midst. A goblin lunged with a spear. The weapon was severed, and the follow-through of the blade cut the creature in half. Another leaped from a ledge above. Vader's hand shot out, and a blast of pure Force energy sent the goblin flying backwards into the rock wall with enough impact to shatter bone. He was not just killing them, he was deconstructing their assault. He used the Force to hurl goblins into their own comrades, to wrench weapons from their hands and send them spinning back into their owners. The air filled with the stench of ozone and seared flesh as the lightsaber carved through the horde. Their numbers, which they had always relied upon, meant nothing. They were throwing themselves against a fortress, and the fortress was fighting back. Terror began to replace their rage. This was not a man, or an elf, or a dwarf. This was a demon, a golem of shadow and death that could not be stopped. They began to break, to flee back into the warren of tunnels from whence they came. Vader let them run. Fear was a more effective weapon than any blade. It would spread through these tunnels like a plague, announcing his presence far more efficiently than a protracted battle. He continued his descent, the corridors now eerily silent. He passed side chambers filled with cowering goblins who trembled and hid their faces as his rhythmic breathing passed their doorways. He was no longer an intruder. He was the new apex predator, and the mountain understood it. Deeper still, he came upon a vast cavernous space. Here the goblins were more organized. They worked crude forges, tended to giant pale cave beasts, and answered to a single monstrous authority. At the center of the cavern, on a throne of rock and bone, sat the great goblin, a bloated, corpulent creature. His flesh was pale and pockmarked, his crown a twisted piece of scrap metal. He was a king of filth and decay. The great goblin roared as Vader entered his throne room, the sound a wet, gurgling bellow. He pointed a fat, greasy finger at the intruder. "Kill it! Kill the black skin!" His bodyguards, a dozen of the largest, most heavily armed goblins, surged forward. But Vader's attention was on the king. He extended his hand, and the great goblin's immense bulk was lifted from his throne with a startled squeal. The bodyguards skidded to a halt, their brutish minds unable to process what they were seeing. "You rule this filth," Vader's amplified voice boomed, the first words he had spoken in this world. They were not a question, but a statement of fact. "You will answer me. What is this world? What powers command it?" The great goblin, suspended in the air, could only gibber in terror. His mind was a shallow pool of greed and ignorance. Vader reached into it with the force, a swift, brutal probe that felt like talons of ice scraping against the inside of the creature's skull. He saw flashes of information, crude and filtered through the goblin's limited perception. The sun, which they feared, the mountains, which were their home, elves, whom they hated, and a deeper, darker name, whispered in the blackest tunnels, a name associated with a great, lidless eye of fire, Sauron. Insufficient, Vader concluded. He had what little he could glean. This creature was no longer useful. He clenched his fist. The great goblin's body imploded, not with a simple crushing force, but as if every internal pressure point had been ruptured at once. The bodyguards shrieked and fled in mindless panic. Vader stood alone in the throne room, the crimson blade of his lightsaber casting long, dancing shadows across the cavern. He had a name, he had a direction, and he had a new, terrified kingdom to serve as his first foothold. The mountain was his. In the hidden valley of Rivendell, the air was still and clear. The light of the late afternoon sun gilded the leaves of the mullein trees, and the sound of waterfalls was a gentle, constant music. Within the walls of the last homely house, Lord Elrond sat in his study, a scroll of ancient lineage spread before him on a table of dark, polished wood. His mind was deep in contemplation, tracing the histories of men and elves through ages of sorrow and fleeting joy. Suddenly, he looked up, his keen elven senses jarred by a sensation he could not name. It was not a sound or a tremor in the earth. It was a disturbance in the very song of the world the Eru Ilúvatar had woven. For a fleeting moment, the gentle music of the valley was silenced, replaced by a profound and utter void. It was as if a stone had been dropped not into a pond, but into the fabric of existence itself, and the ripples it sent out were cold, sharp, and perfectly terrifyingly ordered. It was not the shadow of Mordor. He knew that evil intimately. It was a creeping, corrupting presence, a heat that withered and a malice that gnawed at the will. This was different. This was a cold, disciplined emptiness, a darkness born not of chaos and destruction but of tyrannical, unbending order. It felt manufactured, a will of iron imposed upon the world as alien to the natural magic of Arda as a shard of glass in a loaf of bread. Elrond rose from his chair and walked to the balcony, his eyes turning northeast, towards the jagged peaks of the misty mountains. The sun still shone, the waterfalls still sang, but a new dissonant note had been added to the world's symphony, and it filled him with a deep and unfamiliar dread. Hundreds of leagues to the south, in the golden wood of Lothlorien, Galadriel stood before her mirror. The silver basin was filled with water from a nearby stream, and in its depths she could glimpse things that were, and some things that have not yet come to pass. She had been observing the growing darkness in Dol Guldur, the stirring of evil that signaled Sauron's return to power. But her gaze was pulled violently away. The image in the mirror wavered, the dark tower of the necromancer dissolving like smoke. For a horrifying instant, the water showed her nothing but a black, star-filled abyss, a vision of the endless, cold void from which the world had been shielded. Then, a shape formed, an angular, black helmet. The reflection was not of a physical being but of a will, a consciousness so shielded and fortified that her own formidable power could barely gain a purchase. She tried to press her own mind against it, to see the thoughts and intent within. It was like pushing against a wall of obsidian. She felt no malice in the way she understood it, no glee in destruction, no hunger for decay. Instead, she felt a crushing weight of certainty, an absolute conviction in its own righteousness, and she felt pain, agonizing, unending pain banked like coals in a furnace, fueling an anger as cold and dense as a dying star. Then, the mind pushed back. It was not a crude assault, but a precise, surgical counterpressure. She was suddenly bombarded with visions that were not her own. Glinting metal corridors stretching for miles, ships of impossible size hanging in the blackness of space, swords made of pure, focused light, a city that spanned an entire planet, and a throne room where a wizened, cloaked figure crackled with lightning. The visions were gone as quickly as they came, leaving her gasping, her hand braced against the silver rim of the basin. The Nenya on her finger flared with a cold, protective light. This was not one of the Maiar, fallen or otherwise. It was not a creature of Morgoth's breeding. It was something new, an outsider who wielded a power that operated on principles unknown to elven lore or the wisdom of the Valar. A darkness had come to Middle-earth, but it did not belong to their ancient enemy. At that same moment, on the Great East Road near the borders of the Trollshaws, Gandalf the Grey paused his journey. He had been enjoying a moment of quiet contemplation, puffing on his pipe and watching the smoke rings curl and drift in the breeze. He was on his way to Bree, his mind occupied with the troubles of hobbits and the growing whispers of ringwraiths. He stopped mid-puff, the pipe held inches from his lips. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran down his spine. As one of the Istari, his senses were attuned to the balance of power in the world. He felt the ebb and flow of Sauron's influence, the steadfast light of the elves, the sturdy resilience of the dwarves. This was none of those. This was a sudden, violent intrusion. It felt like a door had been kicked open into a room that was supposed to be sealed. A wind from an alien star had just blown through the world, and it carried with it the scent of ozone, burnt metal, and a singular focused will. He looked towards the misty mountains, a deep furrow creasing his brow. The goblins were stirring, he knew that. But this was no goblin king rising to power. He had felt the spirit of the vanquished Nazgul shriek past him on its journey back to Mordor not long ago, a sign of some great struggle. He had thought it a feat of elven lords or some other power of the West, but now he was not so sure. The feeling lingered. It was a presence, a new piece on the great board of Middle-earth, and it had been placed with a heavy, deliberate hand. It was a shadow, yes, but it did not seem to be allied with the great shadow. It was a power that stood alone, cold and aloof. Curious, Gandalf murmured to himself, tapping the ash from his pipe. And concerning. His plans had just changed. The troubles of Bree could wait. There was a new riddle in the high passes of the mountains, a darkness that needed a name, and Gandalf the Grey was never one to leave a riddle unsolved, especially one that felt so profoundly, dangerously important. He turned his back on the setting sun and began the long trek towards the mountains, his staff tapping a grim, determined rhythm on the ancient road. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie, the will of the Dark Lord was supreme. From the highest chamber of the Barad-dûr, the great eye, lidless and wreathed in flame, surveyed its domain and the world beyond. It was an eye that saw not with light, but with malice and command, its gaze a tangible force that bent the wills of orcs and men and stretched across the leagues to probe the hearts of its enemies. Sauron's immense consciousness was focused on the task at hand, the recovery of the One Ring. His servants, the Nazgul, were abroad, scouring the lands of Eriador. His armies in the east were mustering. The plans laid over 1,000 years were finally coming to fruition. The world of men was weak, the elves were fading, and the dwarves had delved too greedily and too deep. This age was his to claim. The disturbance when it came was a jarring annoyance, a flicker in his perception of the misty mountains. It was not the bickering of the goblins. Their chaotic minds were a constant, grating background noise in his grand symphony of conquest. This was a sudden, sharp spike of violence and order. An entire goblin kingdom, a festering wound he had allowed to persist as a barrier and a nuisance to his enemies, had been silenced, not scattered, not defeated in a prolonged war. Silenced, as if a hand had simply wiped them from the board. The eye turned, its fiery pupil contracting as it focused on the mountain's heart. He could not see the interloper clearly. The being was shielded, its presence a void in his sight, a patch of absolute blackness that his gaze could not penetrate. But he saw the aftermath. He saw the terror in the minds of the few surviving goblins, visions of a black giant with a sword of red fire. He felt the cold, lingering residue of a power that was utterly alien. It was not the magic of the Istari, which felt of the west and the light. It was not the fading grace of the Eldar. It was not even the crude sorcery of the Easterlings. It was something else, a disciplined, aggressive energy that felt as foreign to Arda as the light of a star he had never seen. This was an unacceptable complication, an unknown variable in a meticulously crafted equation. Any power that could subjugate an entire goblin horde single-handedly was a power that needed to be accounted for, and any power that was not his was, by definition, his enemy. The Dark Lord's will surged forth from the Dark Tower, a silent, irresistible command that crossed the blasted plains of Gorgoroth and the dead marshes, seeking his chief servant. The Witch King of Angmar felt the summons at the ruins of Weathertop. He and his brethren had just driven the ranger and the hobbits away, stabbing the ring-bearer with a Morgul blade. The poison was in the hobbit's veins. It was only a matter of time. But as he stood surveying the landscape, a new directive seared through his spectral consciousness. It came directly from the Master, a vision of the snow-capped peaks of the Misty Mountains and a singular imperative command. There is a new power in the high passes, a warrior in black iron. It has crushed the mountain scum and defied my sight. It is an anomaly. Go, find it. Destroy it. Let no rival power rise in my domain. The Witch King felt no curiosity, no fear. He was a vessel for his master's will. This new command superseded the hunt for the halfling. The ring was a prize, but a rival power was a direct threat. He let out a piercing, unholy shriek that tore at the souls of all living things, a sound of utter despair and hatred. It was a signal to his brethren, and a promise of death to his new quarry. He descended the slopes of the ancient watchtower, his black robes flowing around a form that had no substance. His steed, a creature of nightmare from an elder age, awaited him. The fell beast, with its leathery, bat-like wings and serpentine neck, hissed as its master approached. It was a creature bred for terror and swift aerial death. The Witch King mounted the creature, his ethereal weight not even registering on its back. With another soul-rending cry, the fell beast launched itself into the air, its powerful wings beating against the darkening sky. It turned northeast, leaving the pursuit of the ring-bearer to the others. The hunt had changed. The quarry was no longer a small, frightened hobbit, but an unknown warrior, a dark enigma that had dared to cast its own shadow upon a world that belonged to Sauron. As the fell beast soared across the leagues, the Witch King brooded. He was the greatest of the nine, the Black Captain, a sorcerer king of immense power. He had brought the kingdom of Arnor to ruin, and no living man could kill him. This warrior in black iron would learn the folly of challenging the dominion of Mordor. It would feel the terror of his presence, the chill of his blade, and it would break as all others had broken before him. The world had only one Dark Lord, and all other shadows would be consumed by his. The wind on the high pass was a razor, shearing ice and snow from the rock and hurling it into the gray, unforgiving sky. Darth Vader stood on a precipice overlooking a dizzying drop, a black monolith against the white desolation. He was not seeking shelter. He was waiting. The Force had warned him, a cold prickle against his consciousness of an approaching malice, a presence that flew on wings of shadow. He had felt its psychic scream tear across the land, a wave of pure terror designed to paralyze the hearts of mortals. He analyzed it dispassionately. It was a crude instrument, a blunt application of fear that lacked subtlety or focus. His own mastery of fear was an art form, a tool of intimidation and control wielded with surgical precision. This was a mindless howl. The creature appeared first, a black speck against the clouds that grew with terrifying speed. It was a reptilian beast of nightmare, its leathery wings catching the wind as it swooped towards the pass. On its back sat a figure cloaked in black, a rider whose very form seemed to drink the light from the air. This was the Nazgul. As it drew closer, the full weight of its power washed over Vader. It was an aura of profound despair, a spiritual coldness that promised death and decay. To any living being it would have been an overwhelming assault on the will to live. Vader felt it, not as an emotion, but as a psychic weapon directed at him. He met it with the unbreachable fortress of his own mind, a consciousness forged in betrayal, tempered in rage, and shielded by the absolute discipline of the dark side. The Nazgul's fear aura broke against him like a wave against a cliff of obsidian. It had no effect. The fell beast let out a piercing shriek as it dove, its talons extended to rip and tear. The rider in black drew a long, thin sword, a blade that seemed to glitter with a faint, sickly light. The Witch King of Angmar had arrived to deliver his master's judgment, Vader did not move from his spot. As the monster descended, its shadow falling over him, he simply raised a hand. He reached out with the force, not to the rider but to the mount. The fell beast, a creature of flesh and bone, was subject to the physical laws of the universe. Vader seized it with a telekinetic grip, arresting its 100-mile-an-hour dive in an instant. The creature's momentum was violently halted in mid-air, its bones groaning under the impossible strain. It flapped its wings in confusion and pain, suspended 10 feet above the pass, held fast by an invisible power it could not comprehend. The Witch King was momentarily thrown by the maneuver. This was not a power he recognized. With an angry hiss he urged his mount on, but it was useless. It was trapped. Vader ignited his lightsaber. The snap hiss was sharp and clear in the thin mountain air, the crimson blade a stark slash of color against the gray and white landscape. "You are a servant," Vader's voice boomed, amplified and metallic. "Your mind is not your own. You serve a master who hides in shadow. Present him to me." The Witch King responded not with words, but with an act of pure sorcery. He pointed his Morgul blade at Vader, and a dart of black energy flew from its tip. It was a curse meant to wither the soul and poison the body. Vader's lightsaber moved in a short, precise arc, intercepting the dark energy. The crimson blade met the curse, and the magic dissipated with a sizzle, like water on hot steel. The Force was a shield against such things, a current that could deflect and absorb the crude magics of this world. Frustrated, the Witch King abandoned his trapped mount. He leaped from the fell beast's back, landing silently on the snow-covered ground. He was taller than a man, an empty space given form by black robes and ancient armor. He held the Morgul blade before him, its power palpable. "You will serve the Lord of the Earth, or you will be delivered to the nothingness that awaits you," the Witch King's voice whispered, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "I serve no one," Vader replied. He began to walk forward, his mechanical breathing a steady rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. The Witch King charged. He was unnaturally fast, a blur of black cloth and glinting steel. He stabbed forward with the Morgul blade, aiming for the armored chest of his opponent. The blade was imbued with a magic that could destroy any mortal it touched, its poison unraveling the victim's spirit and turning them into a wraith under his command. Vader did not sidestep, he simply met the attack. The lightsaber clashed with the Morgul blade. The impact sent a shockwave of competing energies across the pass. The ancient sorcery of Angmar, forged in the Second Age, met the focused plasma of a technology from a galaxy far, far away. The Morgul blade held for a moment, its evil magic resisting the lightsaber's energy. Then, with a pained shriek of tortured metal, it began to glow white-hot. Vader applied pressure, his superior strength augmented by the Force. The Witch King was driven back, his ethereal form struggling against the physical reality of Vader's assault. With a swift, powerful movement, Vader disarmed his opponent. The lightsaber slid down the length of the Morgul blade, and a sharp twist of Vader's wrist sent the ancient weapon spinning out of the Witch King's grasp and into a deep snowbank. The Nazgul was unarmed, but not defeated. It let out its soul-rending shriek, a wave of pure despair meant to shatter Vader's will. At the same time, its physical form began to fade, its robes and armor becoming translucent as it attempted to shift fully into the Wraith world, where no physical blade could harm it. "Your power is fear," Vader stated, his voice cold and analytical. "You have no power over me." He reached out with the Force, not at the Witch King's physical form, but at the spirit within the robes, the tormented, enslaved soul of the man he once was. He did not try to harm it, he simply held it. The Nazgul's retreat into the Wraith world was halted. It was trapped between realms, held fast by a will of iron. The Witch King had never known such a thing. His spirit was bound to the ring, and through the ring, to Sauron. No other power should have been able to touch him. Yet this being was holding his very essence in a crushing grip. "Your master will answer for this intrusion," Vader declared. He raised his lightsaber, the crimson blade humming with power. The Witch King's form solidified in a panic, trying to pull away, but the Force held him fast. The blade swept down. It did not strike armor or cloth, but passed through the empty space where a body should have been. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ancient magic that held the Nazgul's form together was violently disrupted by the lightsaber's energy field. The black robes and armor fell to the ground, empty. A thin, piercing wail echoed across the mountains, the sound of a spirit being forcibly banished from its physical anchor. The Witch King of Angmar, defeated and unmade, fled back towards Mordor, a terrified whisper on the wind. Vader stood over the empty robes. He deactivated his lightsaber and turned his attention to the fell beast, still struggling in his telekinetic grip. With a final, contemptuous flick of his wrist, he snapped the creature's neck and sent its lifeless body tumbling into the chasm below. The pass was silent once more. He had been tested by one of this world's great powers, and he had found it wanting, but the encounter had been informative. This Sauron commanded servants of considerable power. He was a being of consequence, a rival, and now he had Darth Vader's undivided attention. In the cold obsidian tower of Orthanc, surrounded by the blasted, industrialized ring of Isengard, Saruman the White gazed into the depths of the Palantir. He had not been watching the Nazgul's hunt for the ring-bearer. His gaze was fixed on the greater disturbance, the new piece on the board. The Seeing Stone showed him the snow-swept pass in the misty mountains, and he had watched the entire confrontation with an academic, almost predatory fascination. He saw the rider in black, the fell beast, the aura of terror. He recognized the Witch King of Angmar, Sauron's most dreaded captain, and he saw him defeated, not by a company of elven lords, not by the divine power of an Istari, but by a lone, black-armored warrior whose abilities defied every category of lore Saruman possessed. He saw the creature of the air held immobile by a thought. He saw a sword of red light that could parry and destroy ancient sorcery. He saw a will that did not bend to the Nazgul's despair. Saruman, whose own mind was a fortress of pride and intellect, recognized a power of a similar, if alien, nature. This was no orc or man. This was something else, something powerful. Saruman knew, would see this being only as a threat to be crushed. The Dark Lord of Mordor did not tolerate rivals. Gandalf would see it as a dark mystery to be solved, a potential evil to be countered. The elves would see it as an unnatural blight upon the world. But Saruman saw opportunity. He saw a being of immense power, seemingly unaligned with any of the major factions. A being whose methods, direct, overwhelming force, and an aura of absolute authority resonated with Saruman's own evolving philosophy. The age of elves was over. The age of men was at hand, and it would need a firm, wise hand to guide it, a hand of power. He had intended for that hand to be his, with the power of the ring as his tool. But perhaps there were other tools, other hands. A new power is rising, Saruman mused aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber. The smoke from the forges of Isengard curled past his windows, a testament to the new order he was building. It has challenged Mordor and prevailed. It does not serve the White Council. It serves only itself. Such a power must be understood. It must be reasoned with. He knew a direct confrontation was unwise. He also knew that this being would not respond to hollow flattery or weak pleas. Power respected power. He would make an overture, an offering of alliance from one lord to another. He descended from the pinnacle of Orthanc, his white robes flowing behind him. He passed through the great halls and into the sprawling caverns beneath the fortress, where his new army was being forged. The clang of hammers, the roar of bellows, and the guttural chants of the Uruk-hai filled the air. He sought out his most formidable captain, Lurtz, the first of the new Uruks to be bred. Lurtz was a fearsome specimen of strength and cunning, his loyalty to his creator absolute. He was a weapon, and Saruman was about to aim him. Lurtz, Saruman's voice cut through the din. The massive Uruk dropped to one knee, his yellow eyes fixed on the wizard. "You will take a company of your finest scouts," Saruman commanded, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You will travel north, into the foothills of the misty mountains. You will not go to raid or kill. You are to be emissaries." Lurtz's brutish face twisted in confusion. "Emissaries?" "There is a warrior in the mountains," Saruman explained, his eyes glinting with strategic fire, clad in black armor. "He is powerful beyond your reckoning. He has laid low one of the Black Riders. You will find him. You will not engage him. You will approach under a banner of parley." Saruman handed Lurtz a scroll, sealed with the emblem of the White Hand. "Give him this. It is an invitation, an offer of alliance. Tell him that the Lord of Isengard recognizes his strength and wishes to treat with him as equals to bring a new order to this world." Lurtz looked at the scroll, then back at his master. "And if he refuses?" Saruman's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "His response will be informative, whatever it is. Observe him, learn what you can of his methods, his power, but do not, under any circumstances, provoke him. That is an order for Saruman's fools and Gandalf's sentimentalists. We are men of intellect. Now go, swiftly." Lurtz rose, bowed his head, and gathered his company. 20 of the strongest, fastest Uruk-hai, clad in black iron and bearing the white hand on their shields. They were not a war party. They were a statement. They were a display of Saruman's own power, a demonstration of the kind of disciplined, superior soldiery he could create. As the Uruks marched out of Isengard, their heavy boots thudding on the stone, Saruman returned to his chamber. He knew the risks. The Black Warrior might simply destroy his emissaries without a thought, but the potential reward was immeasurable. If this being could be brought to his side, their combined power could topple Sauron himself. Then Saruman, with his intellect and this warrior's might, could reshape Middle-earth as it was always meant to be, a world of order, of knowledge, and of absolute centralized power, a world ruled from the Tower of Orthanc. The thought was intoxicating. Vader had descended from the high passes, leaving the wind-scoured peaks behind. He now moved through the rugged foothills that bordered the ancient forest of Fangorn. The air here was thicker, heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient living wood. The force resonated with a deep, slumbering consciousness that emanated from the trees, a slow, powerful life that was utterly alien to his experience. He noted it, filed it away as another piece of data on this strange world, and continued on his path. He felt the approaching party long before he saw or heard them. They moved with a disciplined tread that was unlike the skittering chaos of the goblins. 20 minds, all burning with a crude but focused aggression, their loyalty bound to a single distant intelligence. He concealed himself within a cluster of dark, weathered stones, a patch of shadow that was indistinguishable from any other. He watched as they entered the clearing. They were tall, powerfully built creatures, a brutish mockery of the human form. Their skin was dark, their faces contorted in a permanent snarl. They were clad in heavy functional iron armor and carried thick-bladed swords and sturdy bows. On their shields was painted a single white hand. They were soldiers, crude, yes, but effective. He felt a flicker of professional appreciation. They were a significant improvement over the disorganized rabble he had encountered thus far. The leader, a particularly large Uruk with a cruel, intelligent face, called a halt. His yellow eyes scanned the clearing. "He is near," Lurtz growled, his senses on high alert. The master said he would be in these lands. Vader chose that moment to reveal himself. He did not step from behind the rocks, he simply was. One moment, the space was empty. The next, he stood there, his crimson blade unlit, his presence a sudden oppressive weight in the clearing. The Uruk-hai reacted with impressive speed, spinning to face him, drawing their blades with a rasp of steel. But they did not attack. They held their ground, forming a defensive semicircle around their captain, their discipline overriding their instinct to charge. Lurtz stared up at the towering figure. This was the warrior his master had described. The air around him felt cold, and the rhythmic breathing was a deeply unsettling sound. He remembered Saruman's command, "Do not provoke him." "We are emissaries of Saruman the White, Lord of Isengard," Lurtz announced, his voice a deep baritone. He held up the sealed scroll. "He sends greetings. He recognizes your power and offers an alliance." Vader remained perfectly still, his helmeted head tilted slightly, as if analyzing a curious specimen. An alliance, a familiar gambit. He had seen it 100 times in the political machinations of the Empire, weaker powers seeking to attach themselves to a greater one for their own benefit. He did not reach for the scroll. Instead, he reached out with the Force, his focus on the captain, Lurtz. He pushed his consciousness into the Uruk's mind. It was a brutish, simple thing, a fortress of loyalty and violence, but it had no defense against a Sith Lord. Vader bypassed the Uruk's thoughts and went straight for his memories, his loyalties, the source of his commands. Lurtz grunted and staggered back, his hand flying to his head. He felt a piercing pain, a violation, as if icy fingers were rummaging through his very being. He saw flashes of his own life, his birth from the mud of Isengard, his training, his absolute devotion to the White Wizard. Vader saw it all in an instant. He saw the Tower of Orthanc, a spike of black rock. He saw the forges and the breeding pits, and he saw the mind of the one who had sent them, Saruman. He felt the wizard's ambition, his pride, his hunger for power, and his desire to control the ring that Vader had sensed earlier. He saw Saruman's belief that he could manipulate this new Dark Lord into becoming his weapon. The wizard was intelligent, Vader conceded, but his ambition far outstripped his power. He was a pale imitation of Palpatine, a regional tyrant who mistook his small dominion for an empire. He was unworthy of consideration. An alliance with such a being would be an encumbrance. "Your master is a fool," Vader's amplified voice declared, the words cutting through the tense silence. "He seeks to use a power he cannot comprehend. He offers a partnership, but he desires a tool." Lurtz, recovering from the mental assault, snarled, "The White Hand is mighty. We will bring order to this world of men." "The order you offer is chaos in a uniform," Vader replied. He raised his hand, palm open. "I will bring true order. Your master has sent you as a message of his strength. I will send you back as a message of mine." Lurtz finally broke discipline. With a roar of fury at the insult to his master, he charged, his heavy blade raised to strike. He never reached his target. Vader clenched his fist. The air around the 20 Uruk-hai solidified. They were frozen in place, their powerful muscles straining against an invisible, irresistible pressure. Lurtz was stopped in mid-stride, his face a mask of rage and confusion. He tried to move, to fight, but it was like being encased in solid stone. Vader ignited his lightsaber. He walked calmly towards the paralyzed Uruks. He started with Lurtz. The Uruk's yellow eyes widened in horror as the crimson blade was raised. Vader made a single clean cut, and the captain's head tumbled from his shoulders. He moved down the line. One by one, he executed the frozen soldiers of Isengard. There was no struggle, no sound except for the hum of the lightsaber and the soft thud of armored bodies and severed heads hitting the ground. It was not a battle. It was a culling, an extermination. When the last Uruk was dispatched, Vader deactivated his blade. He surveyed the scene of silent carnage. Saruman wanted to observe his methods. He had just been given a clear and unequivocal demonstration. He left the bodies where they lay, a stark tableau of death in the clearing, the white hand on their shields a symbol of a rejected and foolish offer. Let the wizard find his emissaries. Let him see the result of his hubris. Darth Vader did not require allies. He required servants, and Saruman of Isengard had just failed the first test. The Council of Elrond was convened in a high portico overlooking the gardens of Rivendell. The last rays of the autumn sun cast long shadows as representatives of the free peoples gathered. Elves, dwarves, and men, factions long estranged by grievance and pride, were brought together by a common, rising dread. The primary subject was, of course, the ring. Boromir of Gondor had spoken of his prophetic dream. Frodo Baggins, the hobbit from the Shire, had revealed the burden he carried, placing the one ring upon the stone plinth at the center of their circle. A hush had fallen over the council as they stared at the simple gold band that held the fate of their world. Gimli, son of Glóin, had tried to destroy it with his axe, only to have the weapon shatter, leaving the ring untouched and gleaming. The air was thick with despair and uncertainty. It was then that Gandalf rose to speak, his face grim, his eyes holding a shadow that was new even to Elrond. "The ring is not our only peril," the wizard began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the council. "Another power has entered this world, a shadow that is not of Mordor's making." A murmur went through the assembled company. Boromir looked skeptical, Legolas curious. "I have journeyed through the high passes of the Misty Mountains, following a trail of rumor and a deep disquiet in my heart," Gandalf continued. "The goblin town that has plagued travelers for centuries is no more. It has been purged, not by war, but by a swift and terrible execution. The few survivors I found gibbered in their caves, speaking of a black giant with a sword of red light." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I thought at first it might be a tale to frighten goblin children, but then, as I climbed higher, I found more proof." His eyes met Elrond's. "On a snow-swept pass, near the very peaks, I found the tattered remains of a black cloak and the twisted, rusted hilt of an ancient sword. I know these artifacts, as does Lord Elrond. They belong to the Witch King of Angmar." A gasp went through the council. Boromir's hand went to the hilt of his own sword. The Lord of the Nazgul, defeated. By whom? Surely it would take the might of the elven lords of old. "That is the riddle," Gandalf said, his gaze distant. "There were no signs of a great battle, no host of elven warriors, only the tracks of a single heavy-booted individual leading away from the site. This being, this warrior in black iron, faced the captain of the Nazgul alone, and he prevailed." Elrond, who had remained silent, now spoke, his voice filled with ancient wisdom and new concern. I have felt this presence. It is a void, a coldness that is alien to Arda. It is a will of iron, a desire for order so absolute that it becomes a tyranny in itself. It is a darkness, but it does not feel like the chaotic malice of the enemy. Gimli stroked his beard, his brow furrowed. A new Dark Lord? As if one were not enough. I do not know what he is, Gandalf confessed, but I know more. On my journey hither, I passed through the foothills where the wizard Saruman now lets his Uruks roam. I found a clearing littered with the bodies of 20 of his best soldiers. They had not been killed in battle, they had been executed, each slain by a single, clean cut from a blade of impossible heat. The council was silent, stunned by these revelations. A new, unknown power was moving in the wild, a being that could annihilate a goblin kingdom, defeat the Lord of the Nazgul, and slaughter a company of Saruman's elite warriors without seeming effort. What does it want? Asked Boromir, his mind struggling to place this new piece on the board of his world. Does it serve Sauron? No, Gandalf said with certainty. The defeat of the Witch King proves that, and Saruman's emissaries were clearly rejected. This power stands alone. It is a third faction in a war that has, until now, only had 2. The weight of this news was immense. They had gathered to decide the fate of the One Ring, a task that already seemed impossible. Now they learned that a new, terrifyingly powerful and utterly unpredictable entity was loose in their world. Was it a potential ally? An even greater threat than Sauron? A random agent of chaos? They had no answers. This changes nothing of our immediate purpose, Elrond declared, his voice cutting through the rising fear. The ring remains the greatest threat. Sauron is the enemy we know. The ring must be unmade, but we must proceed with the knowledge that we are no longer the only players in this game. There are more shadows than one. Frodo Baggins looked from Gandalf's worried face to the gleaming ring on the plinth. He had felt small and insignificant before, a simple hobbit tasked with a burden for the great and powerful. Now he felt even smaller. The world was larger, darker, and more complex than he had ever imagined. And somewhere out in the wilderness, a figure of black armor and red light was carving its own path, a being whose motives and allegiances were a complete mystery, and whose power rivaled the greatest evils of his age. The road to Mordor had just become infinitely more perilous. Darth Vader moved south. His path was a direct, unwavering line, guided by a pull he had not felt since he stood in the presence of his Emperor during a nexus of the dark side. But this was stronger, far stronger. It was a beacon, a siren song of concentrated power that resonated with the very core of his being. He had gleaned its identity from the mind of the Goblin King and seen its significance in the memories of Saruman's captain. The One Ring, a tool of domination forged by the Dark Lord Sauron, an object of ultimate power in this world. As he crossed the barren plains of Eregion, the ruins of the ancient elven smiths crumbling around him like skeletal remains, the feeling intensified. It was not merely a call, it was a promise. The ring was a massive bleeding wound in the force of this world, a vortex of ambition, malice, and the unbending will to control all life. It whispered to the dark side within him, not with words, but with pure, intoxicating sensation. He felt the potential of its power as it related to his own broken body. The constant grinding pain of his scarred flesh, the agony of his prosthetic limbs, the claustrophobia of the suit that was both his prison and his life support. The ring promised an end to it all. It showed him visions of himself made whole again, not as the fallen Jedi Anakin Skywalker, but as Lord Vader, his body perfected, his flesh restored not by crude cybernetics but by pure dark will. He would be able to cast off the helmet, to breathe the air on his own, to feel something other than the recycled chill of his own breath. The temptation was a physical thing, a hunger that gnawed at him, but the promise of physical restoration was a trifle compared to its other offering. The ring promised power on a scale he had only dreamed of. With it he could not just command armies, he could command reality itself. He saw visions of himself standing on the black tower of Barad-dûr, the fiery eye not a symbol of Sauron but a manifestation of his own gaze, seeing all, controlling all. He saw the armies of this world, men, elves and orcs, kneeling before him not in fear but in absolute willing servitude. And beyond that, he saw a path home. The ring's power, he sensed, could tear a hole back to his own galaxy. He would not return as a fugitive or a failure, but as a conqueror. He would return with the armies of Middle-earth at his back, with sorcery and power that his former master had never conceived of. He would shatter both the Empire and the rebellion, and forge a new galactic order in his own image, an order of absolute strength and unshakable stability. It was everything he had ever wanted. The culmination of the journey he began when he first knelt to Darth Sidious. The pull led him to the hidden valley of Rivendell. He did not attempt to enter it directly. The place was shielded by a form of power that felt like a wall of serene, unyielding light. It was passive, defensive, but potent. He could have breached it, he was sure, but a direct assault was crude and unnecessary. The ring was there, and soon it would be on the move. He had only to wait. He found a high vantage point in the cliffs overlooking the valley, a perch from which he could observe without being seen. He cloaked himself in the Force, bending light and sound around him, becoming a patch of silent, unnoticeable shadow. From there he watched the comings and goings of the elves, their graceful movements a stark contrast to the ugliness of the goblins and Uruks. He felt the gathering of powerful minds, the elven lords, the wizard Gandalf, and something else, a sturdy, resilient presence from the race of men, a flicker of ancient royalty. And at the center of it all, he felt the ring. It was like a miniature black hole in the Force, drawing all thought and emotion towards it. It knew he was there. It felt his power, his ambition, his pain, and it called to him, a silent scream of invitation. Take me. We can be one. Together, we can undo all wrongs, punish all who betrayed you, and rule all that is. Vader's control, honed over 2 decades of Sith discipline, was absolute. He acknowledged the temptation, analyzed it, and then suppressed it. To rush in now would be foolish. All the powers of the valley were arrayed against the ring's influence. To take it here would mean a battle against them all at once, an unnecessary expenditure of energy. Patience was the key. He had learned that lesson at his master's knee. He had learned it again in the long, slow process of hunting down the Jedi. Let his enemies do the work for him. They would debate, they would plan, and eventually they would move the ring from this fortress of light. Out in the wild, away from its protectors and its sanctuary, the ring would be vulnerable. He settled into his vigil, his mechanical breathing the only sound in his self-imposed silence. He was a patient hunter, a phantom waiting for his prey to be flushed from its cover. The ring had promised him everything, and Darth Vader always took what was promised to him. The only question was when, and how much blood would be spilled in the taking. The Fellowship of the Ring departed from Rivendell under the cloak of a moonless night. 9 companions, representing the free races of Middle-earth, bound by a single desperate purpose. Their journey south began in secret, their path winding through the rugged wilderness east of the Bruinan River. For the first few days, their journey was tense but uneventful. Aragorn's skill as a ranger guided them through hidden paths, while Gandalf's wisdom kept their spirits from flagging. Yet a palpable sense of being watched followed them, a cold shadow that was more than just the fear of Sauron's spies. It was on the 4th day, as they made their way through a rocky gorge that led down towards the plains, that the feeling intensified. It became a physical presence, a weight in the air that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. Aragorn was the first to give the warning. He stopped dead, his hand held up, his eyes scanning the gray, rocky slopes above them. "We are being followed," he whispered, his voice grim. "And this is no orc pack." Legolas, his keen elven eyes piercing the gloom, nodded in agreement. "There is a presence near. It feels cold, empty." Gandalf's brow was furrowed. He knew what it was. He had felt it drawing nearer for days. "It has found us," he murmured. They emerged from the gorge into a wider, desolate valley floor, a field of gray stones and withered grass. And there, standing in the middle of their path as if he had materialized from the very rock, was the figure Gandalf had described to the council. He was a giant of a man, clad head to toe in polished black armor that seemed to devour the pale light of the overcast day. A black cape fluttered in the cold wind. He was utterly still, his posture one of absolute, unshakable authority. The only sound was the rhythmic, unnatural hiss and sigh of his breathing, a sound that seemed to mock the very act of living. The fellowship froze. Boromir, ever the warrior, instinctively drew his sword, its bright Gondorian steel a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the figure. "What demonry is this?" he growled. Aragorn drew Anduril, the flame of the west, and the ancient blade glittered with a faint, defiant light. Legolas had an arrow knocked to his bowstring before anyone else had moved, the tip aimed squarely at the center of the Black Warrior's chest. Gimli gripped his axe, his knuckles white. The hobbits, terrified, huddled behind them. Darth Vader regarded them through the red lenses of his helmet. He saw their fear, their aggression, their defiance. He saw the flicker of ancient power in the ranger's sword. He saw the stoic readiness of the elf and the dwarf. But his attention, his entire being, was focused on the smallest of them all, the halfling, Frodo. He could feel the ring, hanging on a chain around the hobbit's neck. It was a pulsating heart of darkness, and its proximity was a heady, intoxicating drug. It screamed for him to take it, to strike these fools down and claim his prize. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Stand back, shadow of the abyss," Boromir shouted, taking a protective step in front of the hobbits. Vader ignored him. He raised a hand, not in aggression but as if to brush aside an irritating fly. An unseen force slammed into Boromir, lifting the proud warrior from his feet and throwing him backwards. He landed in a heap 10 feet away, his shield clattering on the stones, the breath knocked from his lungs. Aragorn and Legolas reacted instantly. Legolas released his arrow. It flew, straight and true, aimed at the joint in the armor at the neck. Aragorn surged forward, the light of Andúril held high. The arrow never reached its target. It stopped in mid-air, a foot from Vader's helmet, as if it had struck an invisible wall. It hung there for a moment, trembling, before dropping uselessly to the ground. Aragorn's charge was met with the same unseen power. He felt a crushing pressure against his chest, halting his advance as surely as a mountain collapsing in his path. He strained against it, the muscles in his arms bulging, his feet skidding on the loose rock, but he could get no closer. It was then that Gandalf strode forward, planting his staff firmly on the ground before him. "That is enough," his voice boomed, filled with a power that seemed to make the very stones vibrate. "You shall not harm them. Whoever you are, whatever you seek here, you will deal with me." Vader lowered his hand, releasing Aragorn from the force grip. The ranger stumbled, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with disbelief at the power he had just faced. The black helmet turned to face the wizard. For a long moment, the two figures faced each other across the desolate valley, the ancient servant of the secret fire and the dark lord of the Sith, one a being of divine light and earthy wisdom, the other a vessel of cold fury and technological terror. It was a confrontation of powers that the world of Arda had never before witnessed. "The ring," Vader's amplified voice stated, the sound chilling the air. "Give it to me. Its power is wasted on a creature of such insignificance." "Its power is a poison that would consume even you," Gandalf countered, his staff glowing with a soft white light. "You do not know what you ask. Turn back from this path. There is already one Dark Lord in this land. It does not need another." "I am not him," Vader replied. "He is an agent of chaos and ruin. I am an agent of order. The ring will be the instrument by which I forge a lasting peace upon this world, a peace born of strength and absolute authority." "That is the peace of the grave, the peace of tyranny," Gandalf retorted. "It will not come to pass. You shall not have the ring. I will not allow it." The air between them grew heavy, charged with immense unseen energies. A storm was about to break, a storm of wills that would decide the Fellowship's immediate fate. The confrontation in the Grey Valley was not a battle of swords or spells in the way the Fellowship understood them. It was a silent, titanic struggle of opposing forces, a war fought in the unseen realms of will and spirit. Gandalf stood as a bastion of defiance. The light emanating from his staff intensified, casting away the gloom and bathing the clearing in a pure white radiance. This was not mere wizard's light. It was a glimmer of the secret fire, the divine power of creation that he served. He drew upon his nature as a Maiar, a spirit of the West sent to aid the free peoples. His power was one of preservation, of hope, of resistance against dominion. He pushed this essence outwards, a shield of light and warmth against the cold, oppressive presence of the dark warrior. Darth Vader felt this energy as a searing, painful heat against his own connection to the dark side. It was a light that sought to expose, to purify, to heal, and to him these things were anathema. It was the antithesis of the shadowed, controlled power he wielded. He met the wizard's light not with a shield, but with a crushing, suffocating weight. He drew upon the full depth of his anger, his pain and his decades of discipline in the dark side. He projected his will outwards, a wave of pure, cold domination. The Fellowship felt it as a sudden drop in temperature, a tangible pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from their lungs. The sky above seemed to darken, the gray clouds growing thick and heavy. The light from Gandalf's staff flickered and dimmed under the assault, as if a great shroud were being thrown over it. The two forces met in the space between them, a roiling, invisible vortex of energy. The stones at their feet began to vibrate, and a low hum filled the air, the sound of two immense powers locked in a stalemate. Gandalf gritted his teeth, his face beaded with sweat. He felt the sheer, unbending force of Vader's will. It was like holding back a collapsing mountain. There was no malice in it, no chaotic glee, only an implacable industrial desire to crush all opposition, to flatten the landscape into a smooth, orderly plain. He felt the depths of the warrior's soul, a black sea of loss and self-hatred, refined into a perfect weapon. Vader, in turn, felt the wizard's power as a stubborn, defiant flame that would not be extinguished. It was ancient, and deeply rooted in the world itself. It was a power he could likely overwhelm with time and effort, but it would be a costly, draining struggle, and it was a distraction. His true target was the Hobbit. While the main front of his will was engaged with Gandalf, Vader extended a smaller, sharper tendril of the Force towards Frodo Baggins. The Hobbit, cowering behind Aragorn, suddenly felt a piercing cold in his mind. It was a violation, a sinister whisper that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his soul. "Show me the path. Show me the fire." Frodo cried out and clutched his head, his vision swimming. The ring on its chain grew heavy, its own dark will resonating with Vader's, eager to betray its bearer. In that moment of terror and confusion, Frodo's mind became an open book. Vader saw it all in a flood of images and intentions. He saw the council, the decision to take the ring to Mordor. He saw the map in Frodo's mind, the planned route through the mines of Moria, across the river Anduin, and into the Shadowlands. He saw the final destination, Mount Doom, the crack of doom, the one place the ring could be unmade. The knowledge was acquired in less than a second. It was all he needed. A direct confrontation here was unnecessary. The wizard was a formidable obstacle, but why break through a wall when you can simply wait for the person behind it to walk out the door? With the information secured, Vader abruptly withdrew his power. The oppressive weight vanished, the sky lightened, the hum of energy ceased, the light from Gandalf's staff flared back to its full, steady brightness. The wizard stumbled forward, gasping, the sudden release of pressure leaving him momentarily disoriented. The Fellowship stared, confused by the sudden end to the invisible battle. Vader stood as he had before, a statue of black iron. His objective was complete. He had confirmed the nature of their quest and their intended path. A new strategy formed in his mind with cold, swift clarity. "Your resolve is commendable, wizard," Vader's amplified voice stated, a hint of something that might have been respect in its mechanical tone. "But it is also futile." He turned, his cape sweeping around him, and began to walk away, his back to the stunned companions. "Hold," Aragorn cried, finding his voice. "This is not finished." Vader did not stop or turn. "It is," he said over his shoulder, "for now." He disappeared into the rocky terrain as suddenly as he had appeared, his rhythmic breathing fading into the wind until he was gone. The Fellowship was left alone in the silent valley, their hearts pounding. They had survived, but a deep sense of unease settled over them. They had not won. They had been assessed, probed, and then— "What was that?" Samwise Gamgee whispered, helping a shaken Frodo to his feet. Gandalf leaned heavily on his staff, his face pale and drawn. "That was a power I have never encountered before," he said gravely. He did not retreat. He got what he came for. His eyes met Frodo's, and a new terrible understanding dawned. He knows of our quest. The path to Mordor was still before them, but now it was shadowed by a new, unknown pursuer, one whose motives were as dark and inscrutable as his armor. As Vader moved away from the Fellowship, a cold, logical clarity settled in his mind. The information he had extracted from the Hobbit was a paradigm shift, altering his entire strategic approach to this world. Their quest was to destroy the ring. The concept was, to him, profoundly, almost childishly, naive. He contemplated the sheer, absolute foolishness of their goal. He had felt the power of the ring, a nexus of the dark side so potent it made the most powerful Sith artifacts of his own galaxy seem like trinkets. It was a weapon of ultimate control, an instrument of absolute order. And these creatures, these elves, men and hobbits, driven by sentimental notions of freedom and hope, sought to throw it away. It was akin to the Rebel Alliance capturing the Death Star, and instead of using its planet-destroying power to end the war and enforce their own vision on the galaxy, choosing to fly it into a sun, it was an act of weakness, a failure to comprehend the fundamental nature of power. Power was not meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be wielded. His initial plan had been to seize the ring at the first opportunity, but the confrontation with the wizard Gandalf had been illuminating. The wizard was powerful, a significant obstacle. The combined might of the elven lords in their hidden valley was another, and the creator of the ring, this Sauron, was a third. A direct assault to claim the ring now would mean fighting a war on 3 fronts simultaneously. It was inefficient. It was unnecessary. A new, far more elegant strategy presented itself. These 9 companions, this fellowship, were the perfect unwitting agents. Their quest to carry the ring into the heart of their enemy's territory was a fool's errand, but it was also a perfect delivery service. They would face the dangers of the journey. They would navigate the wilderness, bypass Sauron's patrols, and contend with the treachery of the fallen wizard, Saruman. They would do all the difficult, tedious work of transporting the prize to its final destination, Mordor, Mount Doom. Vader would let them. He would allow them to believe their desperate quest had a chance of success. He would follow, a ghost in their shadow. He would not aid them directly, for that might alert them to his purpose, but he would sanitize their path. He would eliminate external threats that might stop them short of their goal. Sauron's spies, Saruman's hunters, any who might intercept the ring-bearer before he reached the Black Land would be removed. The Hobbit was his asset now, a courier who must be protected until the time of delivery. Then, at the very threshold of Mount Doom, when the Fellowship was exhausted, when Sauron's attention was fixed upon them, when the ring's power was at its absolute peak in the land of its forging, that is when he would strike. He would take the ring from the Hobbit's hands at the final moment. With the ring's power amplified by the fires of its creation, he would be unstoppable. He would challenge Sauron directly. He had already bested the Dark Lord's chief servant. He had no doubt he could defeat the Master. Once Sauron was overthrown, Mordor would be his. The armies of orcs, the fortresses, the entire machinery of war, it would all be his to command. From that seat of power, he would turn his attention to the rest of Middle-earth. The kingdoms of men, the forests of the elves, they would all be brought into his new order, an order of peace and stability, enforced by the unbending will of the ring and its new master. There would be no more petty squabbles between races, no more fading glory or kingdoms in decay. There would only be the absolute, perfect peace of the empire, his empire. This was a worthy goal, a purpose that gave his accidental exile meaning. It was an opportunity to build what he and his former master had always envisioned, but to do it correctly this time. There would be no Senate to placate, no rebel alliance born of hypocrisy. There would only be his will. The decision was made. His new objective was clear. He was no longer a castaway. He was a contender for the throne of this world. He found a high ridge and watched as the small figures of the Fellowship resumed their journey south, their forms silhouetted against the fading light. They were walking towards their doom, thinking it was their salvation. They were carrying the key to his ascension, believing it to be their burden. He began to follow, a patient, dark shepherd guiding his unknowing flock towards the slaughterhouse, where he would claim the prize they had so foolishly guarded. The great game of the War of the Ring had a new player, one who would not abide by its ancient rules. The days that followed the confrontation were steeped in a quiet, gnawing paranoia for the Fellowship. They pushed south at a grueling pace, Aragorn guiding them through the desolate, rocky country of Holland. The sense of being watched did not leave them. If anything, it intensified, becoming a constant oppressive presence at the edge of their senses. Yet they saw no one. The first incident occurred 3 nights later. They had made a cold camp in the lee of a rocky outcrop. Aragorn, on watch, heard the distant howling of wargs, not the sound of lone hunters, but the organized cry of a large, hungry pack. The howls grew closer, a chorus of savage hunger that promised a bloody end. The Fellowship drew their weapons, preparing for a desperate fight. Then, just as the howls reached a fever pitch from the ridge just beyond their camp, a new sound cut through the night, a sharp humming crackle, like the air itself was being torn apart. It was followed by a brief, brilliant flash of crimson light that illuminated the underside of the clouds. Then, silence. The howling stopped, not gradually, but instantly, as if a conductor had cut off his orchestra in the middle of a note. Aragorn and Legolas crept forward to investigate, their movements silent as ghosts. What they found in the moonlight was a scene of inexplicable carnage. The entire warg pack, 30 strong, lay dead. They were not cut by swords or pierced by arrows. Their bodies were blackened and charred, as if they had been struck by a bolt of red lightning. The air was thick with the smell of burnt fur and ozone. There were no tracks, no sign of a battle, just the silent, smoking bodies. They returned to the camp, their faces grim and bewildered. What could do such a thing? Boromir asked, his voice low. I do not know, Gandalf replied, but his eyes were dark with suspicion. He knew of only one power they had encountered that wielded a weapon of red light. A few days later, as they neared the Redhorn Pass, their path was shadowed from above. Samwise Gamgee, glancing nervously at the sky, was the first to spot them. Crebain, he cried, pointing. A vast, dark flock of the large, crow-like birds from Dunland was circling high overhead, their harsh calls echoing down the mountainsides. Spies of Saruman, Gandalf confirmed, urging them to take cover. He knows our path. We must hide. But as the flock began to descend, forming a swirling vortex of black feathers, something went terribly wrong for them. The birds began to fall from the sky, not one or two, but dozens at a time, tumbling end over end like black stones. They did not cry out, they simply collapsed in on themselves in mid-air, as if an invisible giant fist were closing around the flock and squeezing. Within moments the sky was clear. The ground for 100 yards around was littered with the small broken bodies of the Crebain. The Fellowship stared in stunned silence. They had been saved from discovery, but the nature of their deliverance was terrifying. He is clearing our path, Aragorn stated, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Gandalf. But why? Why would this dark warrior aid us? He is not aiding us, Gandalf said, his expression troubled. He is managing his asset. He wants the ring-bearer to reach his destination. I fear he is not our guardian, but our escort, and his intentions at the end of our road are the blackest imaginable. The knowledge was a poison. Every step they took felt as though they were being herded. The freedom of their quest was an illusion. They were puppets, their strings held by Gandalf and the Council, their path shadowed by Sauron's hunters, and the entire stage seemingly curated by this new silent player who moved in the periphery, his motives a terrifying enigma. The paranoia deepened. Every rock formation seemed to hold a black-armored shape. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the faint, rhythmic sound of mechanical breathing. Frodo felt it most keenly. The ring on his chest felt colder, heavier, and sometimes he thought he could feel it pulsing faintly, a dark heart beating in sympathy with the unseen presence that followed them. They were forced to attempt the treacherous pass of Caradhras, where the mountain itself seemed to rise against them, unleashing a blizzard of unnatural fury. As they struggled through the deep snow, Legolas, who could walk upon its surface, suddenly stopped, his head cocked. "What is it, Legolas?" Aragorn shouted over the wind. "The storm," the elf replied, his voice filled with wonder and confusion. "Its will is failing. Something is pushing back against the mountain's anger." And it was true. The wind, which had been a malevolent, tearing force, began to lessen. The snowfall thinned. It was as if the mountain's spirit was being cowed, its rage suppressed by a stronger, more disciplined will. They were able to retreat from the pass, saved from freezing to death not by their own strength but by yet another act of unseen intervention. They had no choice but to take the dark and secret way through the mines of Moria. But as they stood before the doors of Durin, a new and terrible thought occurred to Frodo. If their mysterious follower had been clearing their path on the surface, what would he do when they descended into the earth, where there were far older and fouler things than orcs? Was he leading them from danger, or into the jaws of an even greater one? The dark road into the mountain seemed like a trap, and they had no choice but to spring it. The passage through the long dark of Moria was a trial of nerve and spirit. The Fellowship navigated the silent, echoing halls of the ancient dwarf kingdom, the ghosts of a dead civilization pressing in on all sides. The air was heavy with menace, and the sense of being followed had changed. It was no longer a distant shadow on the horizon, it was a close, intimate presence, a patch of absolute cold moving through the same darkness they did. When they finally emerged, blinking into the daylight on the eastern side of the mountains, they found themselves in the Dimril Dale. Before them lay a forest of gold, the wood of Lothlorien, home of the Lady Galadriel. It was a place of ancient power, a sanctuary of elven magic that had long resisted the growing shadow of the world. As they approached the borders of the Golden Wood, a patrol of Galadrim, the elven guardians of Lorien, intercepted them. Led by Haldir, they were wary but ultimately welcoming. especially of Legolas and Gandalf. Yet as they prepared to lead the fellowship into the forest, Haldir paused, his keen eyes scanning the rocky slopes behind them from which they had just come. "There is another," Haldir stated, his voice a low whisper. "A presence follows you. It is cold and dark, yet it does not feel of the shadow we know. It waits at our borders." Gandalf nodded grimly. "He has followed us all the way. Let us hope the power of your lady is a shield he cannot pass." They were led into the heart of Lorien, to Caras Galadon, the city of trees, its dwellings built high among the mighty Mallarns. There, they were brought before the Lord Celeborn and the Lady Galadriel. Galadriel was terrible and beautiful to behold. Her eyes were deep and filled with a light that seemed to come from an elder age. She greeted them, her voice like music, but her gaze was distant, fixed on the borders of her realm. She could feel him, a mind of impossible strength and discipline, standing just outside her domain like a wolf at the edge of a campfire's light. That night, after the fellowship had been given food and rest, Galadriel went to her mirror. She knew she could not ignore this new power. She had to understand it. She filled the silver basin and stared into its depths, not seeking a vision of the future, but reaching out with her own consciousness, her own formidable telepathic power. "Who are you?" she projected, her thought a calm, clear bell in the silence. "Why do you follow the ring-bearer?" At the border of the forest, Darth Vader stood in the shadows, his senses analyzing the power that permeated this place. It was like the light in Rivendell, but stronger, more ancient, woven into every leaf and branch. He felt the mental probe touch his mind, a gentle but insistent inquiry. It was the most powerful telepathic voice he had ever encountered, far surpassing any Jedi master. He did not resist it. He allowed it in, just a fraction. He wanted to know the nature of this Lady of Light. The connection was established. For a fleeting, timeless moment, two of the most powerful minds in their respective universes were linked. Galadriel gasped. She was plunged into a maelstrom of agony and rage. She saw a desert planet with two suns, a young boy torn from his mother. She saw a temple of warrior monks in flames, and this man, this same being, leading the slaughter, his sword of light cutting down children. She saw him on a river of fire, his body burning, his hatred a force that kept him alive where any other would have perished. She saw the construction of his iron prison, the sealing of the black helmet. She saw him kneeling before a withered, laughing emperor, pledging his life to an order of galactic tyranny. The sheer scale of the pain, the loss, and the cold, burning fury behind it all was overwhelming. It was a darkness so profound it made Sauron's lust for dominion seem like a simple, understandable greed. Vader, in turn, was met with a mind like a star. He saw visions that shook him to his core. He saw the light of two colossal trees illuminating a city of pearl and silver in a land across the sea. He saw the pride and the fire of the Noldor, the greatest of the elven kindreds. He saw her part in their rebellion, their flight into exile. He felt her ancient, weary sorrow, the weight of thousands of years of watching the world she loved slowly fade and decay. He saw the faces of the Valar, the angelic gods of this world, beings of such power that they made both him and his former master seem like infants. He saw her purpose, to protect, to preserve, to resist the slow entropy of time, and he saw her temptation, the One Ring. In her mind he saw what she would become if she took it, a queen, terrible and beautiful, stronger than the foundations of the earth. He recognized the ambition, the desire for the power to set things right, the very same desire that had led him down his own path. She was more like him than he could have imagined. The connection broke, both of them recoiling from the raw intensity of the other. Galadriel stumbled back from her mirror, her breathing ragged. She now understood. This was not a servant of Sauron. This was a fallen hero from another reality, a king in exile, a being whose grief had been forged into a weapon of terrifying power. And he wanted the ring for the same reasons she secretly did, to enforce his own vision of order upon the world. He was, in his own way, even more dangerous than Sauron. Vader stood in the darkness, the rhythmic breathing the only sound. He had seen the heart of his enemy, and found a reflection of himself. This Lady of Light understood power. She understood temptation. She would be a formidable opponent, but her goal was to preserve a fading world. His was to build a new one. History, he knew, always favored the builder over the curator. He would let her give the Fellowship their sanctuary. He would wait. The dark road beneath the mountains was coming, and he knew it held a challenge worthy of his attention. The Fellowship's stay in Lothlorien was a brief respite, a golden dream in a world of growing shadow. But their path lay forward, and after receiving gifts from the Lord and Lady, they departed by boat down the river Anduin. Vader followed, a silent shadow on the shore, his patience unwavering. He watched their internal strife from afar, feeling the ring's poison work on the man Boromir. He watched them pass the Argonath, the mighty statues of the kings of old. He felt their indecision as Frodo chose his own path, to go to Mordor alone. But Vader's interest lay in the route Gandalf had originally chosen, the path that had been denied them by the storm on Caradhras. He had sensed something in the mountain, a presence of immense, ancient power, and he was determined to face it. While the Fellowship scattered at Amon Hen, Vader turned back north. He had no interest in the petty squabbles of orcs and men. He entered the mines of Moria through the same eastern gate the Fellowship had exited, the waters of the Mirror reflecting his dark form. The darkness of the mines was absolute, but it was no hindrance to him. He moved through the ruined halls of Khazad-dûm with purpose, the Force guiding his steps and his sensors mapping the labyrinthine tunnels. He felt the lingering fear of the Fellowship, the stench of the goblin horde that had pursued them, and beneath it all the slumbering, fiery heart of the mountain's true master. He found the chamber of Mazarbul, the tomb of Balin, and saw the signs of the Fellowship's desperate battle. He continued on, deeper and deeper, following the trail of power to its source. It led him to the bridge of Khazad-dûm, a slender arch of stone spanning a chasm of immeasurable depth. And from the depths it came. First, a wave of heat, as if a great furnace door had been opened. Then, a shadow, a presence of such ancient and profound malice that it seemed to suck the very air from the vast cavern. The shadow grew, taking a form of a man, but greater. It was a being of living darkness, its heart a core of roiling fire. In its hands, it carried a whip of many thongs and a sword of pure, molten flame. A Balrog of Morgoth, a demon of the ancient world, awakened from its millennia of slumber. The creature had sensed the passage of the wizard, a power of light and flame that was its ancient enemy. Now it sensed a new power, a darkness that was cold and disciplined, and it rose to meet this challenge to its domain. The Balrog roared, a sound of cracking stone and volcanic eruption, and stepped onto the bridge. Vader stood on the opposite end, his lightsaber unlit. He regarded the creature. He had faced many powerful beasts in his time, the monsters of Dexun, the Zillo beast of Malistar. This was something else. It was not merely an animal. It was a semi-sentient being of pure, elemental rage. It was a nexus of the dark side in its most raw and chaotic form. "You are a relic," Vader's amplified voice echoed in the cavern, a calm, mechanical sound against the Balrog's infernal roar. "Your age is past." The Balrog took another step onto the bridge, its fiery sword held high. It did not understand the words, but it understood the challenge. Vader ignited his lightsaber. The crimson blade sprang to life, its clean technological hum a stark contrast to the wild roaring flames of the Balrog's weapons. The demon charged, its massive form surprisingly swift. The flaming sword descended in a crushing arc meant to shatter the stone bridge and its opponent with it. Vader met the charge. He did not sidestep or retreat. He held his ground, his lightsaber held in a two-handed grip. The sword of fire met the blade of plasma. The impact was cataclysmic. A shockwave of energy erupted from the two weapons, sending a wave of heat and force blasting through the cavern. The stone of the bridge beneath their feet glowed white-hot at the point of contact. The Balrog's strength was immense, the power of a fallen Maiar. But Vader's connection to the Force, focused through his blade, was a thing of pure, unyielding energy. For a moment they were locked, fire against plasma, ancient magic against futuristic technology. The Balrog roared in frustration, pushing with all its might. Vader stood his ground, a black iron statue against a living inferno. Then, with a surge of the Force, Vader pushed back. The Balrog was thrown off balance, stumbling backward a step. Vader pressed his advantage, his lightsaber moving in a series of swift, precise attacks. He was not a brawler like the demon, he was a duelist, a master of combat. His blade cut a deep burning line across the Balrog's chest. The demon roared in pain, its shadowy form smoking where the lightsaber had touched, but the wound began to fill with fire, healing itself. Its physical body was merely a shell for its fiery spirit. The Balrog lashed out with its whip of flame. The thongs cracked through the air, seeking to ensnare Vader and drag him into the chasm. Vader simply raised a hand. The fiery whip was caught in a force grip, its lashes writhing and struggling against the invisible power that held them. With a sharp, contemptuous twist of his wrist, Vader tore the whip from the Balrog's grasp and sent it spiraling into the abyss below. The Balrog was now enraged beyond reason. It abandoned its sword and charged forward, seeking to grapple with its foe, to crush the life from him with its bare hands. This was the opening Vader had been waiting for. The creature was powerful, but it was mindless, driven by pure rage. It was predictable. As the Balrog thundered across the final stretch of the bridge, Vader reached out with the Force, not at the demon but at the bridge itself. He seized the ancient stonework, the key structural points that held the arch together. He poured his power into it, seeking the stress points, the fractures, the weaknesses in the dwarf craft. The stone groaned. Cracks began to spread from where Vader stood, racing across the length of the bridge like black lightning. The Balrog, its mind consumed with fury, did not notice until it was too late. Just as it reached Vader, its hands outstretched to seize him, the bridge of Khazad-dûm collapsed. The ancient arch of stone did not simply crumble, it exploded downwards in a shower of rock and dust. The Balrog, its forward momentum carrying it into empty space, let out a final surprised roar as it plunged into the abyss. For a moment it fell, a creature of fire swallowed by absolute darkness. But Darth Vader was not Gandalf. He had no intention of being dragged down with his foe. He was not there to sacrifice himself. He was there to conquer. As the bridge disintegrated beneath his feet, he had already leaped backwards, a force-assisted jump that carried him effortlessly back to the solid ground of the cavern's edge. He landed without a sound, his cape settling around him as he watched the demon fall. The battle was not over. A fiery whip snaked up from the chasm, cracking through the air and wrapping itself around Vader's ankle. The Balrog, even in its fall, was trying to ensure its killer shared its fate. Vader looked down at the fiery tendril coiling around his leg. The heat was immense, enough to melt ordinary steel, but his armor, forged with the secrets of the Sith and built to withstand blaster fire, held firm. He did not struggle. He simply tightened his will. He reached out with the Force once more, but this time his target was not the bridge or the demon. It was the cavern itself. The vaulted ceilings above, the massive pillars that had stood for thousands of years, he seized them all in his telekinetic grip. The entire chamber of the second hall groaned under the immense focused pressure. Stalactites, each the size of a small starship, began to shear away from the ceiling. Great house-sized boulders tore loose from the cavern walls. With a final, decisive gesture, he brought it all down. Tons of rock, a veritable avalanche of stone, plunged into the chasm. It was not a random collapse, it was a targeted bombardment. The rain of rock hammered the falling Balrog, crushing its fiery form, extinguishing its ancient flame under a mountain of its own making. The whip around Vader's ankle dissolved into harmless smoke as the demon's spirit was finally irrevocably crushed. The thunder of the collapse was deafening, the echoes rolling through the deeps for what seemed like an eternity. A vast cloud of dust rose from the chasm, filling the cavern with a choking haze. When the last echo had faded, silence returned to the depths of Moria, a profound, tomb-like silence. Darth Vader stood at the edge of the newly widened abyss, a dark, solitary figure in the gloom. He had faced a demon from the dawn of this world, a creature of immense elemental power, and he had destroyed it, not through sacrifice, but through the ruthless and efficient application of superior power. He had not just defeated the mountain's master, he had broken the mountain itself to do it. A sense of cold satisfaction settled over him. This place, this ancient ruined kingdom of Khazad-dûm, was now his. Its darkness, its isolation, its strategic location in the heart of the misty mountains, it would make a perfect fortress, a base of operations from which he could plan his next move. He turned his back on the chasm and began the long walk back towards the eastern gate. The Fellowship was scattered. The wizard they had relied upon was, as far as they knew, gone. They were vulnerable. But his plan had not changed. Let the hobbit continue his desperate journey to Mordor. Let him be the bait in the trap. Vader had a new home to secure. The goblins that remained in the upper levels would be brought to heel, transformed from a chaotic rabble into a disciplined legion of servants. The forges of the dwarves, long cold, would be rekindled. The darkness of Moria would no longer be a place of slumbering evil. It would become a bastion of the dark side, a center of cold, efficient industrial order. He emerged from the mines into the pale light of Dimril Dale, the golden woods of Lothlorien visible in the distance. He felt the gaze of the Lady of Light upon him, a mixture of horror, fear, and grudging respect. She knew what had happened in the deeps. She knew that the Balrog was gone, only to be replaced by something far more dangerous. The race for the ring was still on, but the board had changed irrevocably. Sauron in the south had a rival. The Free Peoples in the west had a new, terrifying enigma to contend with. And here, in the heart of the world, a new kingdom was being forged in darkness and shadow, ruled not by a demon of chaotic rage, but by a dark lord of cold, unbending will. Moria now belonged to the Sith, and from this dark throne, Lord Vader would prepare for the final war, the war for the One Ring, and for the soul of Middle-earth itself.